The Portuguese schooner Aragante was captured in late November 1837 by HMS Snake off the coast of Cuba. At the time, the Aragante had more than 330 Africans on board who had been shipped from the Upper Guinea coast. Once the vessel arrived in Montego Bay, Jamaica, the British authorities apprenticed those who had survived. Shortly after landing, however, the Aragante's sailors were accused of slaughtering an African man, cooking his flesh, and forcing the rest of those enslaved on board to eat it. Furthermore, they were also accused of cooking and eating themselves the heart and liver of the same man. This article focuses not so much on the actual event as on the transatlantic process that followed, during which knowledge was produced and contested, and relative meanings and predetermined cultural notions associated with Europeans and Africans were probed and queried. At dawn on November 23, 1837, HMS Snake, under the command of Captain Alexander Milne, spotted a suspicious brig on the horizon just off Cuba's westernmost point, the Cape of San Antonio. On the brig, a slave vessel named Aragante, the sailors saw a large cruiser ship in the distance, a circumstance that led the captain to give orders to find an escape route as quickly as possible. The getaway attempt was short-lived, as the fast-sailing British cruiser soon caught up with the slave traders, although only after being forced to fire several shots at it, and in spite of the heavy rains and winds that made the chase all the more difficult. Upon boarding the ship, Captain Milne reported that its decks were crammed with enslaved Africans kept in atrocious conditions. In a private letter to his brother, written a couple of months later, Milne referred to the Africans on board as actual skeletons with death in their countenances. Milne, a seasoned officer who had encountered several slave vessels before, confessed to be shocked as never before by the sight of dead children lying about the deck, while others were in the last stage, all calling for food and water and pointing to their mouths. Without wasting any time, Captain Milne sent Lieutenant Robert Boyle Miller to take control of the Aragante as prize master and to guide her immediately to Montego Bay, Jamaica, in order to disembark the Africans before continuing toward Sierra Leone, where the vessel and the crew were to be brought before the Anglo-Portuguese Court of Mixed Commission. In the meantime, and after seizing yet another slave ship only hours later, Milne and the Snake sailed to the Jagua harbor on the south side of the island of Cuba, where they delivered most of the Aragante's crew and their passengers to the governor of the fort of Jagua. The Aragante, with a crew of 35 men, mostly Portuguese, which included the captain, the pilot, and other officers, plus 8 passengers, had obtained her human cargo 40 days before from the notorious Spanish slave dealer Pedro Blanco, who incidentally was one of the 8 passengers, at the mouth of the river Galinas on the Upper Guinea coast. A total of 470 Africans, many of them children and adolescents, had been crowded under the small deck of the brig and sent on their way to Cuba, almost certainly consigned to the house of Pedro Martinez & Co. of Havana and Cadiz. When the ship came across HMS Snake, 64 of them had died, and by the time the Africans were landed in Montego Bay 11 days later, 74 more had passed away, in spite of all the attentions given to them by the assistant surgeon of HMS Snake, who had accompanied Lieutenant Miller. That the violence effected upon this group of enslaved Africans had been exceptional became even clearer upon their arrival in Jamaica. There, John Roby, the collector of customs at Montego Bay, was just as perplexed as Captain Milne had been before him. In a letter sent to Commodore Peter John Douglas months later, Roby recounted the horrible state of disease and emaciation prevailing among them, explaining that the thighs of many were not thicker than his own wrist. More alarming, however, was the revelation that many of the Africans made soon afterward. On various occasions upon their arrival and over the next few months, a considerable number of them, mostly children and adolescents, said repeatedly and to different people that one of the Africans on board the Aragante had been murdered, and that, subsequently, the sailors had cooked pieces of his body and served them with rice to the rest of the Africans. Many other accusations of beatings, rapes, and other various violent punishments were levied against the captain and crew. Although Roby, Lieutenant Miller, and others who came into contact with them remained skeptical throughout, others, including the collector of customs at Lusaia, a coastal town west of Montego Bay, Lyndon Howard Evelyn, the senior magistrate at Hanover, Alexander Campbell, and Special Justice of Peace, Hall Pringle, were convinced that the young Africans were telling the truth and denouncing an event that had indeed taken place. Evelyn, perhaps the most outspoken of them all, went as far as stating in public that the long and patient hearing of the evidence and the careful observing for many days of the tone and bearing of the many witnesses who were brought before the commission, suddenly, without concert, from various places, and about 9 months subsequent to the alleged perpetration of the crime, were conclusive evidence that the horrors described by the Africans were not the result of their vivid imagination, as had been suggested. Among those horrors, cannibalism was just one. Rape, torture and beatings, sadistic murders, and another accusation of cannibalism, this one directed toward the ship's sailors, filled page after page of depositions. Perhaps due to the challenging nature of the accusation, and to the fact that, as Vincent Brown has contended, these inquests laid out the axes, boundaries, and values of community, it took between 7 and 8 months for the British authorities in Jamaica to give enough credence to the testimony of these young Africans before reluctantly starting a proper investigation that eventually involved them as well as the Colonial Office and the Admiralty. During that time, the Africans had first been taken care of, although of the 332 who were landed in Montego Bay, 66 died in the following weeks and then hastily apprenticed, according to the dispositions associated with the Emancipation Act of 1833, within the parishes of St. James and Hanover in northwestern Jamaica. The story these children and young men and women told was simply harrowing. According to many of them, a few days before being seized by the British cruiser, one of them, a grown-up man called Mina, who according to all descriptions given was not a black man but a yellow man, was forced to drink alcohol. Then, after being taken behind a sail on the bow, he was slaughtered. Although, as one would expect, some minor specifics in the testimonies of the witnesses are inconsistent, most of them agreed that the man cried out for help as he was being killed, and that his blood remained on deck until the next day. Some witnesses claimed that his head, hands, and feet were cut off and thrown overboard, and then the rest of him was cut in small square pieces and served to the rest of the Africans on board as food. Furthermore, in a very revealing testimony, one witness stated that Mina's heart and liver were also cooked and then eaten by the Portuguese sailors. Regardless of whether cannibalistic practices did indeed take place on board the Arroganti, by examining this case through a combination of ethnographic and microhistorical methods, it is possible to challenge the omniscient narrator's voice that dominates in the paperwork created as a result of the investigation. In doing so, it is also possible to scrutinize and query the reasons why the colonial authorities in Jamaica, as well as the Colonial Office and the Admiralty, failed to fully investigate the accusations of cannibalism. Using the resulting court records to reenact a trial of the past with the aim of reaching different conclusions is neither desirable nor practical. Instead, this article seeks to present an alternative interpretation to those offered by the colonial authorities who were in charge of the investigation, as well as to challenge the very core values and beliefs that stopped those same magistrates from pursuing promising leads and from further interrogating witnesses in search of what may have been, to them, an inconvenient truth. This approach will allow for a critical reflection on how cultural and ethical conventions can be shaped and reshaped across cultures. In this specific case, with respect to those of the slave ship crew, the enslaved Africans, the British officers, and the magistrates in Jamaica. At this point, some questions about the way in which the British colonial authorities in Jamaica dealt with the investigation can be put forward. Did they really fail to believe the Africans, or did they instead choose not to believe them in the hope of avoiding a long, potentially embarrassing judicial process during which the superiority of their own culture and civilization might be brought into question? In any case, why were they so keen on shutting down the judicial process even before the final set of witnesses had been interrogated? Cannibalism has often been discussed with reference to pre-industrial societies, and especially in the case of African peoples, it has been a constant, irrespective of their particular origins, cultural traditions, and relationships with other cultures and societies. Within the Atlantic Basin, since the time of the first contact between European and Caribbean peoples, it was consistently considered as a marker of so-called uncivilized peoples, contrary to morality and to natural laws. By focusing on the events that occurred on a slave ship and their subsequent interpretation by the British colonial authorities in Jamaica, it is possible to offer a different, complementary historical narrative that reveals a reversal of roles, one in which Europeans appear as flesh-eating savages and Africans as the civilized people horrified by this behavior, a version of history that may be even just as valid as the traditional one, which regularly portrays Africans as cannibals. The case of the Arroganti occurred at a pivotal historical moment within the British Empire, just as the final abolition of African slavery came into being, concluding a process of emancipation that was denoted by the compensation of slave owners and the forced apprenticeship to which the enslaved population was subjected. Just as the British intensified the pursuing of slavers across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, illegal human trafficking activities expanded across vast regions of West, West Central, and East Africa. Simultaneously with this British reinvention as an anti-slavery power, and on the back of new free trade notions, an emerging new type of British imperialism, characterized by exceptionalist and racist ideas and policies, developed and expanded worldwide. Perhaps, as a result of these ideas and policies, the magistrates involved in this case repeatedly failed to listen to the Africans' version of events. This was not by any means a new phenomenon in the slavery-tainted Atlantic world. While examining the aftermath of the 1692 slave conspiracy in Barbados, historian Jason T. Sharples was keen to indicate that local magistrates could only listen imperfectly to the voices of those Africans who testified before them. They evaluated informants' ideas and recorded aspects of them that aligned with their own notions of possible forms of insurrection. In many ways, they did the same more than a century later in Jamaica. First, when they plainly refused to accept that the arrogant sailors could be capable of undertaking such a barbaric and immoral practice as cannibalism, and then when they decided to focus all their attention on the cooking and serving of the African man's flesh to the other enslaved Africans on board. This choice was questionable, especially if we consider that rather than one, there were two distinctly separated accusations, one relating to the enslaved Africans being forced to engage in cannibalism, and another to the ship's crew eating specific human body parts themselves. In fact, all those investigating the events willfully ignored the second, more troubling accusation of cannibalism, which pertained to the Portuguese sailors, not the Africans, eating the heart and the liver of Mina, thus de facto clearing them, and by extension all Europeans, of what they considered an even more dreadful and implausible charge. In doing so, they also refused to give any credibility to the testimony of the African children and adolescents who witnessed the alleged butchery. Instead, they chose to believe the testimonies of a small minority of Africans, also mostly children and adolescents, whose accounts were unbalanced and highly questionable, including those of Bamboo and Kekula, who denied ever seeing or hearing of the events, and those of Kai and Tom, who did not have access to the upper deck and thus should have never been considered as key witnesses. All in all, because of their prejudiced understanding of the world, they struggled to make sense of an event that presented that same world turned upside down. Inevitably, one must wonder whether this was an isolated, excessively violent event in what was generally a world of cruelty and impunity. However, repeated allusions to white cannibalism, which have not gone unnoticed by historians, and the continuous fear of being cooked and served as food that was felt by Africans about to embark on Atlantic crossings, point to the plausible prospect that, sheltered by distance, isolation, and lawlessness while at sea, other similar instances may have indeed taken place between the 16th and the 19th centuries. White cannibalism during Atlantic crossings. To slave ship masters and crews, what happened on the ship stayed on the ship. The very illicit character of the slave trade after 1820 provided them with a near-perfect environment to express their deepest and most sadistic desires and needs, often to their own financial detriment. Rape, torture, beatings, outright murder, and even mass killings were nothing rare in the illegal Atlantic. As a matter of fact, by the time the Arrogant was seized by HMS Snake in 1837, such crimes were so common that they barely merited a few lines in colonial and foreign office letters and reports whenever they happened. There is little doubt that by keeping these abuses away from public knowledge, slave ship captains and crews bestowed upon themselves a considerable degree of impunity. 15. The Africans of the Amistad had originated from the same West African regions as those of the Arrogant, and their uprising had taken place just a year and a few months after the Arrogant's Africans were forced to endure their own Atlantic crossing. Here, according to the existing records, the Amistad's cook, a racially mixed man named Celestino, decided to repeatedly tease the Africans by making gestures with his knife, drawing the blade's edge across his throat, and then making a chopping motion with his knife to show that their bodies would then be hacked to bits by the white men. Finally, Celestino pointed to a barrel of salt beef, implying that it was filled with the bodies of Africans who had made a previous voyage. The fear of being killed, cooked, and eaten felt by the Amistad's Africans, which led them to confront their captors, was by no means unique. Fear of white cannibalism had existed among West and West Central Africans since at least the 16th century. From the beginnings of the age of European expansionism in the Atlantic, Africans seem to have been wary of the prospect of being eaten by white men. Historical evidence suggests that at least from the 16th century onward, the Portuguese were told in West Africa that Africans believed that Christians ate human flesh and that all the slaves they bought were carried away to eat. The very experience of being carried to the coast and being put on a crammed ship, governed by often never-seen-before white men, may have played a significant role in the existence of such beliefs. As historian Joseph C. Miller has argued, the darkness of the slave ship's hold was a propitious environment for the growth of ubiquitous fears of Portuguese cannibalism. As the slave trade expanded over the following centuries, references to this fear continued to appear in the historical record. In the late 18th century, Olaudah Equiano discussed it, specifically recalling how the sight of the boiling pot on the slave ship had overpowered him with horror and anguish. Slave traders were well aware of these potential problems and of the consequences that they could have for the preservation of their human cargo. They knew that frightened Africans could either rebel or take their own lives, and thus they frequently endeavored to take measures to allay the fear of white cannibalism as much as possible. Eric Robert Taylor, for example, has discussed how, on Portuguese ships, owners urged captains to avoid using metal cauldrons, which were often left steaming on deck for the purpose of cooking the slaves' food, because many Africans believed they were to be boiled alive in them. In fact, this fear still existed among Africans by the time the transatlantic slave trade was finally coming to an end. In the mid-1860s, British explorer William Winwood Reade was surprised to find out during a visit to West Central Africa that some of the Fang people from the area near Cape Lopez, in what is today Gabon, considered him to be a cannibal. He wrote, "The best of it was that he, an African man he had befriended and whom he thought was a real cannibal, thought I was a cannibal too." A belief which is universal among the bush tribes of Western Africa and of which the slave trade has been the cause. That Reade blamed the slave trade for such a belief is not surprising in the slightest. Maybe Africans were right to be frightened of white cannibals, basing their fear on previous genuine, rather than imagined, episodes of brutality that may have included cannibalism, and that were better concealed than the occurrence on the Arroganti. The existing narratives about this fear point to a consistency over time of similar beliefs that cannot be easily overlooked. In reality, no in-depth study based on primary sources exists on the extent to which Africans' belief in white cannibalism may have been grounded in fact. Often relying on the narratives of contemporaries like Equiano, scholars have repeatedly referred to this fear without being able to find specific cases that could enable them to shed further light on the issue. This belief, due to a lack of evidence, has often been placed in the realm of metaphor, when it may have been quite tangible. In fact, other than the case of the Arrogante, there is only one other recorded example in which European slave traders practiced a sort of coerced cannibalism by forcing some of their captives to eat the heart and liver of one of their companions, who had rebelled against the master and crew. This case, on the vessel Robert from Bristol in 1721, also revealed the perpetration of a wide range of sadistic punishments, and was, until now, the only one that indicated that white European slave traders had no moral or ethical qualms about resorting to cannibalism, if necessary, even if they were not eating human flesh themselves. Cannibalism, as other inhumane sorts of behavior, was a practice associated not with Europeans, but with the other, African, Amerindian, and Australasian peoples. To the British magistrates who interrogated the Arrogants Africans in Jamaica, any admission that the white man could practice cannibalism was nothing short of a cultural aberration that was likely to be rejected at once as a threat to their moral values and laws. In the words of Redeker, cannibalism was one of the idioms through which the war called the slave trade was waged. Europeans had long justified the trade and slavery more broadly by saying that Africans were savage man-eaters who must be civilized by exposure to the more advanced life and thought of Christian Europe. Such a discourse represented Western civilization as a pace-setter, both in technological advancements and moral principles, where barbaric practices like cannibalism were a thing of the past. In this spirit, it became a norm to refer to African peoples as uncivilized heathens who were in need of the white man's God and enlightening progress. Travelers, missionaries, slave traders, British abolitionists, and diverse colonial administrators were regularly at pains to point out the savage and backward character of the peoples they met 18. In some cases, as in that of explorer Reed, preconceptions of various kinds may have clouded the judgments they made about the peoples they came across. Reed, who had been in close contact with Christian missionaries since his arrival in Africa, stated that these missionaries were certain that the Fang were cannibals, a suspicion Reed promptly embraced. To his credit, however, he noticed that they had arrived at this conclusion in spite of never having seen a single case of cannibalism or receiving a clear confession of cannibalism from one of them. In another, similar case, Augustus P. Arkwright, an officer at HMS Prompt, wrote to his grandfather from West Africa in 1842, casually describing his interaction with locals while carrying out anti-slavery patrols as living among savages and boating off cannibals. On almost all occasions that Africans were taken across the Atlantic, they were viewed as barbarous, ungrateful, and incapable of enjoying the technological advances and the moral blessings of Western civilization. In Cuba, they were presented as cannibals in a memorandum to the Spanish king in 1790. In Brazil, the French consul in Bahia, Francis de Castelnau, interviewed several Africans in the late 1840s as he attempted to learn more about the Azandi people of Central Africa, who were reputed to be cannibals and often referred to as the Nyam Nyam people, a pejorative name that clearly referred to their supposedly cannibalistic habits. In Britain in 1831, at the time the epicenter of the fight against the slave trade in the Atlantic, the African Repository and Colonial Journal went as far as describing Africa as a land where despotism, superstition, and barbarism have unitedly and for ages held dark dominion. Although these beliefs in African backwardness and cannibalism permeated most of the public sphere and discourse in most of the Western world, at least from the early 19th century, there were some isolated attempts to challenge their authenticity. A case in point is that of James Stephen, who in 1821 published his strictures on the charge of cannibalism on the African race, in which he meticulously revised the existing literature and reports written and published by those who had come into contact with various African peoples, concluding that all accusations of cannibalism were beyond doubt unfounded. His, however, was to be an exceptional digression that was hardly ever cited or repeated anywhere. Even though in 18th and 19th century Europe cannibalistic practices, including some related to the consumption of body parts reputed to cure medical problems, remained in existence, cannibalism had become a custom intrinsically associated with non-Western and especially African peoples. White cannibalism, on the other hand, continued to be more of a dwindling myth than a demonstrated fact, in spite of the work of authors like William Cullen, who in 1806 was keen to point out that such practices had existed and still continued to exist at the time in parts of the Western world. To the Arrogance Africans, however, this primordial fear soon turned into a very violent reality when the vessel where they had been crammed together was transformed into what historian Rosalind Shaw has aptly called a space of deadly transformation. Examining their experiences, then, can help us shed light on the traumatic experience they were forced to endure during their Atlantic crossing, and on the extent of the ineptitude, real or otherwise, shown by most of those who came into contact with them and dismissed beforehand their accounts in the following days and months. Of the 266 Africans who survived the Arrogance ordeal, 24 were brought before various colonial officers to testify in the case. Since adult men and women were kept below deck during the entire Atlantic crossing, among those who saw Mina's murder, there were only children and adolescents of both sexes, all of whom appeared extremely distressed during their depositions. As they faced their own individual traumas, they showed a steely resolution, first by repeatedly denouncing the murder they had witnessed, and then by insisting on having their voices heard before the British magistrates who interviewed them. These children and adolescents had all been embarked at the infamous slave factory of Galinas, belonging to the notorious Spanish slave trader Pedro Blanco, who accompanied them on their transatlantic voyage. In many ways, their life histories seem to have been remarkably similar to the children of the Amistad, who have been the focus of an excellent book by Benjamin Lawrence. Like many of the children of the Amistad, those of the Arroganti had been sent to Galenas from the interior of the continent after being enslaved through kidnapping and warfare. And they had spent time in the slave barracoons located there. Like the children of the Amistad, they were put on a vessel headed for the island of Cuba, and like them, they were forced to endure the traumatic experience of the Atlantic crossing. It would not be far-fetched to suggest that some of them may have known or may have even been related to those on the Amistad, since they had been embarked just over a year prior to the embarkation of the majority of the children on the Amistad, not considered as savages, backward, and capable of cannibalism. The second one concerns these officers' hasty rejection of the testimonies of the African children and adolescents who came forward with very similar accounts of the harrowing events they had experienced. Instead, and based on their prejudiced opinion of the intelligence of those they interrogated, they chose to believe the Africans, also children and adolescents, whose statements matched their predisposed and prejudiced judgments of the events. There is little doubt that many were left traumatized by this experience. One of them, Sadea, a half-sister of Mina, the man who was allegedly killed and cannibalized, burst into tears as she told those questioning her about how the sailors had murdered her older brother. Another one, Manu, had her examination adjourned after showing signs of fatigue and fear or excitement, while recalling the impression that this event had had upon her. It is no small feat that 6 of them assured the authorities in Jamaica that they had seen the crime with their own eyes. Of these, Saru was between 12 and 13 years of age, her sister Manu between 13 and 14, Fabro was about 12, Sekwi was 16, Sadea was but a girl, and Kali was between 18 and 20. These 6 Africans, who had coincidentally been placed in areas such as the space near the kitchen and other limited areas near the upper deck where they were very likely to have witnessed the events they described, recounted in a coherent fashion, almost to the smallest detail, how the events had unfolded. They all described how the Portuguese sailors took Mina behind a sail that they had put up across the deck to stop the rest of the Africans from witnessing what was about to happen. Sadea, as well as at least 2 others, described how her brother had screamed, "Sadea, they do kill me," as he was being murdered. The testimony of Kali, also a half-brother of Mina, was almost identical. According to him, Mina had called, "Sadea, Sadea, they are killing me." Other Africans who had heard the screams gave similar descriptions of the events, confirming the testimonies of Mina's half-siblings. Manu, who had peeped through the holes in the sail that the sailors had used to cover their actions, described how they cut Mina's throat with a long knife and how he had cried out just beforehand, "They kill me, oh!" Another young African girl, Samu, told how she had also heard someone on the deck scream, "They'da kill me, oh," while she was below deck. There is little doubt that the story of the murder became a defining event in the shipmates' memories of their Atlantic crossing. By most accounts, even those who had not seen the murder or heard the man's screams had heard some of their shipmates talking about the murder directly afterward. Some, like Gemma and Faula, conveyed their shock at seeing a large amount of blood running about the deck of the ship and falling through a hole to the sea. Nango, another young African girl, gave an even more unnerving version of this event, telling how she and other young girls had seen drops of blood coming through one place in the deck, one by one, into the hold. Right after hearing somebody above bawling, "They are killing me, they are killing me." Beyond these disturbing stories, in the days that followed Mina's assassination, there were accounts of a suspect meat being presented to the captives for consumption. The fact that the only other possible source of red meat on board at the time was a hog that was still alive days later when HMS Snake seized the vessel made the accusations even more plausible. Certainly, many of the Africans interrogated throughout July and August 1838 discussed at length how, after they had seen or heard about Mina's death, they had been served a foul-smelling and bad-tasting red meat that had made many of them vomit. 7 of those interrogated in Montego Bay and Lucia agreed that the meat was different. Many of them went as far as to explain that in addition to being very red, it was flavored like horse meat. It had no bones, and that it also had somebody hairs in it. More revealing, 2 or 3 of those questioned, mostly young girls who were placed near the ship's kitchen during the Atlantic crossing, confirmed that the flesh of Mina had been cut into small pieces and specifically cooked in the big pot destined for the Africans. At least one of them, Saru, asserted that the sailors had also cooked the liver and heart of Mina in their own smaller pot and then had eaten those parts themselves. Saru's testimony was confirmed by Cawley, who saw the sailors put the heart and the liver into a pot the next day, in an act that was consistent with the previous and subsequent behavior of the Arrogant's crew. Those who rejected the strange meat were severely punished for doing so. Many of the witnesses agreed on the fact that the sailors beat to death many of those who refused to eat it. For example, Bressa revealed that when they refused the meat, the sailors beat them very bad. Bressa also added that so many died from the Spaniards beating them that he was not able to count them. Another African who also discussed the quality of the meat at length, Kienia, pointed out that the beatings were carried out with the ship ropes. These testimonies were also confirmed by Nambe, who testified that some of the Africans below deck were beat so much that they died afterwards. Even Kekula and Bamboo, 2 of the 4 enslaved Africans who denied seeing or hearing anything about the murder and dismembering of Mina, agreed that another man called Bangba had been flogged to death with a rope and a Cat O' earlier in the Atlantic crossing. If we are to believe the words of these 2 young girls, even after the British seized the ship, the slave dealers were able to carry on abusing and murdering the Africans under the very eyes of those who were supposed to stop them from doing so. Despite all these claims, however, it is worth noting here that each and every one of the Arrogant's crew were set at liberty soon after, as they were Portuguese subjects over whom British courts in Jamaica had no jurisdiction. Shortly after Evelyn sent his first letter on this matter, informing Commodore Douglas about the atrocities that some of the Arrogantes Africans had been denouncing for months, a much-delayed inquest into the possible act of cannibalism was ordered. This was, by all means, as uncommon an investigation as they had ever experienced. After all, to them, the accusations against the crew of the Arroganti represented nothing short of an alarming turnaround of the traditional roles ascribed to Europeans and Africans. This time, they were not asked to confirm, once again, the barbaric customs of the uncivilized Africans that were trafficked across the Atlantic, or even to question the sort of well-known sadistic brutalities frequently carried out by slave trade crews at sea. This time, the stakes were much higher. This was a case that, in a straightforward way, challenged the superiority of white men, their Western civilization, and their Christian values and beliefs. 24 of the surviving Africans were interrogated through July and August by 3 different sets of people. A first group of 13 Africans testified between July 2 and 11 in front of Justices Walter Finlayson and Richard B. Facey. A second group of 3 Africans, including Bamboo, who had also been interviewed by Finlayson and Facey, testified before John Roby and his associate P. Spencer between July 17 and 23. Finally, a third group of 11 Africans, which included Kayenia and Cawley, both of whom had also been interviewed by Finlayson and Facey, came before Campbell, Pringle, and occasionally Evelyn in Lusaia between July 18th and August 2nd. It was in this last group that the largest number of direct witnesses was concentrated. Sadly, by the time they testified, Finlayson and Facey, mostly basing their conclusions on a biased letter sent by Lieutenant Miller, on the subjective opinion of Roby and on the erratic deposition of Bamboo, had hurriedly concluded that there was not sufficient evidence to substantiate the allegation that the slaves in question were subsisted on human flesh during the voyage, an inference that seems to have satisfied the colonial authorities in Kingston and Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, Lord Glenelg, in London, even though the investigation in Jamaica was not entirely closed until early August. Lieutenant Miller's letter of July 6th in particular was quite damaging to the Africans' cause. In this missive, he stated his disbelief that something so horrible could have happened on the ship without him being informed. Lieutenant Miller also based his opinion on the fact that there were 2 Africans on board who were able to speak English and who never told him a word about these brutalities, and on his one-sided appreciation of the Arrogant's captain, with whom he had become acquainted and whom he considered to be inoffensive and not capable of such a horrible transaction. 49. All the circumstantial arguments presented by Lieutenant Miller in this letter were quite problematic, and yet they were readily accepted by Justices Finlayson and Facey. His assumption that a slave ship captain who, according to his own words, had carried out 6 voyages to Africa was inoffensive or incapable of allowing such a monstrosity was naive at best, and perhaps revealed his own internal struggle to comprehend the magnitude of the accusations that had been leveled against the ship's crew. Furthermore, his supposition that an event like the one described by the Africans could not have taken place without him being informed was at best an incredulous attempt to conceal his own lack of awareness of events that were taking place under his authority, and that could bring into question his effectiveness as prize officer. This is especially the case if we consider that a young African girl was beaten to death during the night by one of the sailors after Miller had assumed command, without him ever hearing of it. Even more questionable was the fact that Lieutenant Miller readily chose to rely on the testimonies of 2 recaptured Africans who were found on board the Arroganti, perhaps because they were able to speak some English. What he purposely failed to disclose while portraying their statements as conclusive is that both of them, Kai and Tom, had spent the entire voyage in chains and below the deck, as they asserted months later before John Roby, thus rendering their personal experiences on board and their knowledge of any event occurring above deck essentially useless. John Roby's take on the matter was just as prejudiced. As far as he was concerned, the Africans he had talked to about the issue could not give him precise information on whether human flesh had been served to them. Regardless, and contradicting himself to a certain extent, he twice confirmed that upon their arrival, belief in the authenticity of the incident was very prevalent among them, and he also admitted that they all seemed to have heard it, and most of them seemed to believe it. Just as Lieutenant Miller had done before, the subjective opinion that Roby had formed a priori about the veracity of the Africans' testimonies, conceivably as a result of his own limitations in coming to terms with such a particularly ominous claim, also led him to doubt the fact that the mostly white Portuguese sailors could ever be capable of the brutalities they were being accused of. In his letter to Evelyn, Roby tried to sway his colleague's opinion by stressing the grounds for his disbelief, going as far as suggesting that even though they were all aware of the cruelties usually committed by slave ship crews, they should not paint the devil blacker than he is. The third opinion held in high regard by Finlayson and Facey was that of Bamboo, one of the African children, he was 12, who spent most of the Atlantic crossing serving as a cabin boy to the ship's captain, and who was considered to be very intelligent by Roby, Finlayson, and Facey. As a matter of fact, Bamboo's refutation of the evidence given by many of his companions was perhaps more instrumental than any other opinion, including those of first-hand witnesses Cawley and Sequi, who repeatedly gave very similar narratives of the event, accusing the sailors of murder, and who coincidentally agreed on the fact that Bamboo had also witnessed the murder of Mina. What is more telling, when Bamboo and Sequi were cross-examined, it became clear that Bamboo's original testimony was inconsistent and contradictory, and that he was either falsifying or concealing information. In spite of these glaring problems, Finlayson and Facey chose not to question the accuracy of his words. When he was asked to challenge Sequi's account of the murder and subsequent act of cannibalism, Bamboo failed to do so. His only answer was that at the time he was too little, and thus could not remember every detail. Irrespective of the blunt inconsistencies of Bamboo's testimony, Finlayson and Facey preferred it to those of Sequi and Cawley, likely because it was more convenient to them and their prejudiced vision of what could be real and or believable and what was not. On more than one occasion, they made biased, adulatory remarks about Bamboo's intelligence, contrasting it with the limited trustworthiness of Sequi and Cawley. Even though they were older, Sequi was approximately 16 and Cawley between 18 and 20, and in spite of their testimonies remaining consistent throughout. Cawley, the witness with the most coherent account of the events, was dismissed as a liar based on the opinion other Africans had of him. His testimony was also dismissed based on the fact that since his arrival, the police had twice arrested him due to his repeated complaints about his master, Mr. Allwood. Cawley, like the rest of his surviving shipmates, had been placed under the system of apprenticeship adopted in the island 5 years before, which in effect had placed him under the supervision of a local resident for whom he was forced to work. Obviously not an acquiescent apprentice laborer, Cawley never had his intelligence praised by anyone, even though, remarkably, he had become fully fluent in English after just 9 months of living in Jamaica. The fact is that all three sets of colonial authorities seem to have classified the Africans who appeared before them into very loose good and bad categories, which were broadly related to their behavior since their time of arrival on the Caribbean island. The testimonies of those who had abided by the colonial law and obeyed their assigned employers were invariably given more weight than the testimonies of those like Sequi or Cawley, who had, in their eyes, failed to show the sort of obedience that was expected of them. Equally troublesome was the overall methodology followed by all three sets of investigators. By repeatedly and consistently focusing on the meat that was served to the Africans, all three disregarded the fact that at least 2 witnesses strongly suggested the possibility that the Portuguese sailors themselves had feasted on the heart and liver of Mina. The fact that no further questions were asked every time one of the Africans mentioned this peculiar behavior indicates a deliberate or subconscious lack of awareness in following up a lead that could have revealed to them the extreme and deadly levels of violence perpetrated by Europeans aboard slave ships. Another central problem with the investigation was the failure of the authorities to interview as many potential witnesses as possible. Although by any accounts there were more than 260 Africans who could have been questioned, only 24 were called. John Roby himself, while being questioned by Finlayson and Facey, mentioned the names of several of them who could have been brought before the authorities, including Tamba, Tumba, Jumbo, Luka, and 3 boys named Kabingi, all of them aged between 12 and 16. Some convincing evidence also suggested that at least half of these 24 witnesses were subjectively selected based on how intelligent they appeared to be and not by the likelihood of their potential as key direct witnesses. The testimonies taken by Finlayson and Facey and by Roby and Spencer denote a lack of diligence that calls into question not only their investigative ability to decide which leads to pursue, but also their ethics and actual interest in finding out the truth of what had happened during the Arrogante's Atlantic crossing. The most damning indication of this lack of diligence was when they overlooked the testimonies gathered by Campbell and Pringle in Lucia barely a few days later and hastily dismissed the case. This, it should be pointed out, was not the only time that the behavior of Finlayson and Facey indicated bias against the testimony of Africans within their parish. Less than a year later, they would be accused by none other than John Roby himself of dismissing an unambiguous case of excessive punishment dispensed by a local neighbor on an apprenticed African girl. In this case, they also failed to follow procedure, only hearing the testimony of the abusive white neighbor and dismissing the charges presented as utterly unfounded and malicious without ever listening to the accusing party. Campbell and Pringle also seem to have been selective in which Africans they interviewed, although they at least seem to have chosen potential key witnesses among the 11 Africans they deposed. Their conclusions, not surprisingly, were entirely different to those of Miller, Finlayson, Facey, and Roby. In their report, which was subsequently picked up and published in the pages of the British Emancipator, they stated that they were convinced that Mina had been murdered in cold blood, and that they were satisfied that part of this man's body was served to the other slaves as food. Unfortunately, by then, Governor Lionel Smith, just like others before him, had decided to close the matter for good, and the report of Campbell and Pringle was filed away. Conclusions: although the colonial authorities in Jamaica dismissed the accusations against the crew of the Arrogante, the sui generis character of the incident turned it into a sort of cause célèbre over the next year in Britain, and even in the United States, repeatedly featuring in the abolitionist press and fueling public debate about the evils of the slave trade, at a time when British abolitionist policies in the Atlantic were being forcefully redefined. From the moment the Morning Journal published part of the process started by Finlayson, Facey, and Roby on April 9, 1839, a number of articles, mostly condemning the atrocities committed by the Arrogante's crew and the impartiality and legitimacy of the actual process conducted in Jamaica, began to appear, turning Mina and his fellow shipmates into what Vincent Brown has referred to as transatlantic spirits. At some point, even Evelyn himself, months after inciting the start of the investigation and shortly before his death, wrote his observations on the case, which were later published in the British Emancipator, dissecting the partial and implausible arguments given by Lieutenant Miller and exposing the flaws of the investigation carried out by British magistrates and government officers in Jamaica. Months after Campbell and Pringle took the testimonies of 11 Africans, Evelyn was still riled about the colonial authorities' lack of action in Jamaica and was lobbying the government to do something about it. In a letter sent to Lord Glenelg in November 1838, Evelyn pledged to no longer withhold his opinions on the matter, which had been the result of the careful observing for many days of the tone and bearing of the many witnesses that had been brought before Campbell and Pringle without previous warning and from various locations. Ultimately, Evelyn struggled to convince Governor Smith, Lord Glenelg, and the rest of the British establishment, both in Jamaica and in Britain, of the alleged atrocities committed by the crew of the Arrogante, fell on deaf ears. The sailors were all taken to Cuba and Sierra Leone, where they were freed and able to enroll in other slave trading expeditions should they have wished to do so. The case was abandoned, even by the press, and it was only when the vessel was eventually destroyed in mid-1840 that some newspapers resurrected the story for a few days. Ultimately, whether the slave traders fed the enslaved Africans below the deck with the flesh of one of their own companions does not really constitute the center of this story. What the case of the Aragont really highlights is the frightening thought that the atrocities committed during Atlantic crossings were so many and varied, even in a single voyage, as this case reveals, that they were likely to be overlooked unless certain human traffickers had taken them to an entirely new level. Due to the isolation and distance provided by the Atlantic, rape, beatings, malnourishment, and lack of medical attention, among the many other sorts of violent acts perpetrated against Africans, became so frequent that for British officers on land and at sea, they were not worthy of notice, except on extraordinary occasions. Distance in cases like this generated a total lack of compassion for fellow human beings that was well documented throughout the 19th century. In this respect, the Aragont provides us with a window into the world of violence on the slave ship, but also into the world of indifference and apathy shown by those interested in bringing this inhuman traffic to an end. What actually happened on the ship? Were there, as quite a few of the Africans testified, one or more instances of cannibalism, in addition to a wide array of other types of violence? Although the testimonies of most of the witnesses seem to point to a positive answer, we will probably never know the truth, precisely because the events described took place under the control of the very slave traders who were accused of committing them. Does that mean that we should dismiss the voices of these witnesses because of their age, origins, or color of their skin, just as most of their Western contemporaries did? The actual investigation carried out by the British authorities in Jamaica, these individuals' interpretation of the world, and their consideration and understanding of the testimonies offered by the Africans they interrogated offer some clues as to whether they even considered giving them the benefit of the doubt. In most cases, from Lieutenant Miller to Lord Glenelg, they appear to have made up their minds even before they listened to or read the allegations. Even so, once the process had begun, they were all forced to reluctantly perform their duties, arguably in order to legitimize the more civilized and superior nature of British governance. The testimonies offered by the witnesses were quite substantial about the veracity of the events. The testimonies offered by the witnesses were quite substantial about the veracity of the events they described. Among the repeated failures of the colonial authorities in Jamaica to come to terms with the story that was presented to them by the Africans, they chose to ignore the fact that several key witnesses swore to having seen with their own eyes the murder of Mina, and that several others had heard his screams and seen his blood shortly afterward. More to the point, most of them, according to the one person who received and took care of them after their landing, had heard about this particular crime and were fully convinced that the murder and subsequent serving of human flesh had indeed taken place. Among them, many had similar comments and remarks about the quality of the meat they had been offered after Mina was killed, and at least one was positive that the Portuguese sailors, almost certainly mostly white men, had also participated in the feast, reserving for themselves Mina's heart and liver. The fact that the authorities were unable to find a reasonable explanation for the origin of this different meat served during the Atlantic crossing also reinforces the credibility of the accusations of cannibalism made by the Africans. This specific detail should not go unnoticed, as it is probably central to understanding the reasons behind Mina's alleged slaughtering. Were the Portuguese sailors acting out of pure sadism, or were they more interested in the conceivable powers that eating this different man's heart and liver could offer them? Here, one final line of investigation shall remain open, since we do not know the precise composition of the Aragonte's crew, even though we have their names. From the muster roll, we can guess that at least one of them, Francisco Liberato, was an African or a descendant of Africans. But were the other 34 all white Portuguese from Portugal, Cape Verde, or other parts of the Portuguese Atlantic world, or were there more Africans among them, as was customary on many slave ships of the period? Based on the existing evidence, namely the muster roll, the logbook, and the other papers confiscated by the British, it is reasonable to assume that the vast majority were white men and Portuguese subjects. Had they been otherwise, especially if they had been Africans or of African descent, it is almost certain that such an important detail would have been revealed in the previously mentioned documents taken from the ship or by Lieutenant Miller's letter to Roby's warnings about not painting the devil blacker than he is. Anyone reading this criminal inquest is likely to be stunned by the prejudice, sloppiness, and indolence, real or otherwise, shown by most of those who were tasked with finding out the truth behind this gruesome accusation. In most of the cases, we can only speculate that a subconscious cultural empathy for other whites prevailed over logical inquisitiveness and reasoning. Perhaps a lack of interest in following clues that could have led to a longer investigation process may have also played a part, discouraging them from interrogating more of the Aragontes Africans and preventing them from digging deeper in the hope of finding some actual answers. Perhaps the physical absence of those accused may have played a part as well. Contemporary ideas commonly held in Great Britain, which suggested that Africans were undoubtedly morally and intellectually inferior, may have also led to the apparent underestimation of the depositions given by many of these children and young adults. The testimonies of these African children and adolescents were doubted and ultimately dismissed as they challenged the very core of Western and Christian cultural and religious values. By making such claims, the Africans placed the reluctant public officers forced to deal with their case in a difficult situation. The historical records left by them clearly point to an almost universal concerted attempt to dismiss, often beforehand, the accusations of cannibalism made by the Africans against the Portuguese sailors. As a matter of fact, the term cannibalism was never even used, not once, by any of those involved in the investigation, in sharp contrast with its widespread use across the Western Hemisphere whenever Africans were charged with the same crime. Throughout the investigation, those asking the questions resorted instead to the use of euphemisms and elaborate language that concealed the real meanings and softened the judicial process as it wended its way towards a preordained and uneventful conclusion. This article has not attempted to prove that one likely example of flesh-eating Europeans is sufficient to represent what may have actually happened in almost 4 centuries of transatlantic slave trade. Instead, the examination of the documents bequeathed to us by the protagonists, witnesses, and authorities emphasize at the very least 2 challenging findings. The first, and perhaps most significant one, relates to the refusal of most of the British colonial officers involved in the case to even conceive of the possibility of a world in which fellow Europeans appeared to be less civilized than the same Africans they often considered as savages, backward, and capable of cannibalism. The second one concerns these officers' hasty rejection of the testimonies of the African children and adolescents who came forward with very similar accounts of the harrowing events they had experienced. Instead, and based on their prejudiced opinion of the intelligence of those they interrogated, they chose to believe the Africans, also children and adolescents, whose statements matched their predisposed and prejudiced judgments of the events.